This video will be centered around the theme of conservation in the continental United States and how biodiversity relates to any conservation efforts we may hope to make. The goals of this presentation is to highlight and evaluate past efforts of conservation in the lower 48 by looking at competing viewpoints among experts. From there, we will go on to explain why biodiversity is important and why conserving biodiversity is essential. Finally, we will bring attention to the lack of overlap between areas of high biodiversity and vulnerable species and areas that are protected for conservation. In his article entitled U.S. Protected Lands Mismatch Biodiversity Priorities, Clinton Jenkins explains some research he has done that looks into the shortcomings of past conservation efforts in the continental United States. Jenkins argues that conservation efforts must be made with vulnerable species at the forefront. He identifies these vulnerable species as species that have a small range, are endemic to a certain region, and do not live in protected areas. These three criteria make up Jenkins's priority index, which he uses to determine which species require protection the most. In his research, Jenkins found that the Southeast is an immensely biodiverse area that has some of the highest concentration of vulnerable species in the entire continental U.S. From there, the author goes on to argue that conservation efforts should be focused in these high priority index areas with a strategy of obtaining easements from private lands in these regions. This map is a visual representation of the priority index that Jenkins was describing. The areas in bright red are regions in which the most vulnerable, small range, endemic animals living in unprotected areas are. We will come back to this map layer several times throughout this video. In response to Jenkins's controversial article, Christopher Brown and his colleagues voiced their disagreement. The authors state that Jenkins's findings do not effectively protect biodiversity or take into account the economic limits of their goals. This article argues that conservation should prioritize actions and not species or places. Brown points out that seeking easements of private lands that Jenkins identified would be extremely costly, and that conservation efforts should be spent putting money towards obtaining the most cost-effective land as possible to protect the most area as possible. Vulnerable species are not the only species whose well-being we should have in mind. In response to Brown's article, Jenkins publishes a short article pointing out its faults. Jenkins states that obtaining the most land possible for conservation oversimplifies the issue and does not get to the core problems with conservation. This idea of getting the most land for the cheapest price is what has led conservation to be based on protecting landscapes and not protecting species. Again, Jenkins emphasizes his belief that conservation efforts should be directed to vulnerable species with biodiversity in mind. Finally, Jenkins addresses that there is not one single solution for all conservation efforts. Local communities must take into mind their unique situations when deciding how to conserve for biodiversity. When we are discussing conserving for biodiversity, it is important to note why biodiversity is vital. In his book, The Handbook for Global Climate and Environmental Policy, Robert Faulkner addresses this very topic. Faulkner points out the economic benefits that come along with biodiversity. This can be anything from an influx in tourism to the ecosystem services that come along with biodiversity, such as storm protection. The author goes on to state that early land easements did not consider climate change's effect on biodiversity when they were established. This is important to note when talking about Jenkins's belief that private land easements are a necessity to future conservation efforts. Climate change is one of the biggest threats to biodiversity, which has led an estimated 200 species on Earth to go extinct every 24 hours. The research question I'll be focusing on is, in looking at protected lands in the U.S. and comparing that data with priority indexes from Jenkins's research, can we identify where our conservation efforts should be placed to protect biodiversity and vulnerable species? The model I built for this research question uses three data layers. The bottom layer provides information on protected public lands in the continental U.S. These lands can be seen depicted in green. I ran that information through the Feature to Point tool, which provided me with information on protected points in the lower 48. After receiving that data, I ran it through the Point Density tool, which in turn provided me with neighborhood protection data, which simply put is the centroid of the protected lands and points. This data is seen in blue. To relate this information to conservation priorities, I then overlaid my protected public lands and neighborhood protection layers over Jenkins's priority index map. The result provided us with a visual representation of where protected areas are in relation to regions of high priority according to Jenkins' three criteria of small range, endemic, and non-protected lands. As we can see from this animated GIF, areas in the West have a far higher concentration of neighborhood protection but a far lower priority index than that of the East, specifically the Southeast. In conclusion, we can see that our recent conservation efforts have not been placed in areas that protect the most vulnerable species as possible. Our data shows that this means investing more conservation efforts in the Southeast is necessary. In an era of climate change, it is essential that we protect our biodiversity. With this information that has been gathered, it is the hope that conservation efforts will be made to protect high priority areas and ensure the health and growth of biodiversity.